Tonight, we're going to address the central question that lies at the heart of the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. And this issue is whether or not the Jewish people have any legitimate claim to the land of Israel. Do we have a right to live there and have an independent state? It's important to be careful to clearly understand what's on the table tonight and what isn't. Obviously, we're going to argue in favor of the proposition that the Jewish people have a strong case for their claim to the land of Israel. But that does not equate to saying that everything that the government of Israel does is absolutely right. These are two different issues. I would like to raise one additional point before we get started, and that is a rhetorical question that should be pondered. Why is it that Israel is the only country on the planet whose legitimacy is constantly being challenged and who has to always justify its existence? The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and most Latin American countries were established by Europeans with no legitimate claims to these lands. Many North African countries were simply conquered and transformed by Arab Islamic invaders, and yet only Israel has to defend its right to exist. This series is entitled The Truth Behind the Lies. In the book of Psalms, chapter 85, verse 12, we read, "Truth springs out of the ground." Rabbi Yitzchak Meir, the first Gerer Rebbe, asked, how is the ground to be fertilized so that truth can grow? And he answered that once falsehood is buried, on that very spot, truth can grow. So the first and most critical lie that we will endeavor to refute tonight is the accusation that the Jewish people have no legitimate claim to the land of Israel and that we have basically stolen a land that belongs to other people. King Solomon in Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 12, says, "V'hachut hamishulash lo bimheira yinatek." A three-plied cord is not easily severed. As we're going to see, the claim of the Jewish people to the land of Israel rests upon at least three solid foundations. Let's begin with one prong of the argument that may not carry weight with all people, but is very relevant to those who accept the authority of the Bible. As is well known, the Hebrew Scriptures begins with Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And it's often translated, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Rashi, the great Torah commentator writing in France around 1,000 years ago, asks, why does the Bible begin with the account of the creation of the world? Because the word Torah means instruction. So Rashi wonders, why doesn't the Torah begin with the first instruction, the first law, which would be in Exodus, the book of Exodus, chapter 12, which discusses the law of sanctifying the new moon each month. The very first commandment in the Torah. If the Torah is a book of law, let the Torah begin there with the first law. Why do we need to hear all these stories about the creation of the world and Noah and the ark? Who needs that? Those are not laws. And he answers that the Torah begins with the account of God creating the world to establish his absolute ownership of the world. If you make something, you own it. You break it, you pay for it. But the creation of the world establishes God as the absolute owner of the world, And in that capacity, he has the right to assign land to whoever he chooses. And because we see in the scriptures that the Creator very clearly gave the land of Israel to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as an eternal possession, we cannot be accused of stealing the land of others. There are dozens of biblical passages that clearly and explicitly show that God assigned the land of Canaan, which later became known as the land of Israel, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. For example, Genesis chapter 12, verse 7, after Abraham leaves Mesopotamia, his homeland, and arrives in Canaan, God says, "To your offspring I will give this land." Right off the bat, one of the first things God says to Abraham is that you've come to this land, and I'm going to give it to your offspring. And God repeats this promise to Abraham in chapter 15 of Genesis, verse 18, and there he spells out the boundaries of the promised land. In Genesis chapter 26, verse 3, God promises this land to Isaac, the son of Abraham, and his descendants. And then in Genesis chapter 28, verse 13, God promises this land to Jacob and to his descendants. And then we go to the book of Exodus, and there in chapter 6, verse 4, God tells Moses in Egypt that he established his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give them the land of Canaan. And again, these are just a handful of verses among dozens of passages in the Bible which clearly tell us that God has assigned and given the land of Israel to the people of Israel, to the Jewish people. And the truth is that when we study the 5 books of Moses, the entire narrative of the Bible from the Exodus out of Egypt until the end of the book of Deuteronomy, what is the storyline? The entire storyline, the entire narrative centers on the journey of the nation of Israel through the desert for 40 years to the promised land. And the next biblical book after the end of Deuteronomy, the book of Joshua, describes how the people of Israel conquer and settle the land. When the Bible describes the future utopian messianic age, we find numerous passages describing how God will bring about an ingathering of Jewish exiles, Jewish people who've been exiled throughout the world back to their ancestral land. For example, the prophet Ezekiel in chapter 20, verses 41 to 42. I will accept you favorably when I remove you from the peoples and gather you from the lands where you were scattered. Then you will know that I am the Lord, when I bring you to the soil of Israel, to the land about which I raised my hand to give to your forefathers. And there are dozens of such passages. It's worth noting that the biblical teaching that God granted the land of Israel to the Jewish people is confirmed in the Quran. So in Surah 5, verses 20 to 21, it says, "And when Moses said to his people, 'O my people, remember God's blessings upon you, when he appointed prophets among you and appointed you kings, and gave you that which he gave to no other in the world. O my people, enter the holy land, which God has prescribed for you, and do not turn back, for then you will be overthrown.'" It's also significant that the Quran teaches that Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel was never abolished. And the Quran speaks about the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel before the final judgment. We see this in Surah 17, verse 104, which says, "And thereafter we said to the children of Israel, dwell securely in the promised land, And when the promise of the hereafter comes to pass, we shall bring you as a mixed assembly. The second foundation of the rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel rests upon our long and ancient history and attachment to the land. The origins of the Jewish people, as we've mentioned, go back almost 4,000 years to when Abraham migrated from Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan. And as we said, this was the land that God promised Abraham and his descendants as an eternal possession. Abraham's grandson Jacob and his family were forced to leave Canaan and to go down to Egypt during a severe famine in Canaan. And there they became enslaved for 210 years. And they developed over those centuries into a large and significant nation. Around 3,300 years ago, Moses led them to freedom, and they trekked through the desert toward the Promised Land. And then they conquered and settled it under the leadership of Joshua. For more than 1,600 years, the Jewish people were the main settled population of the land of Israel. For much of this time, the land was ruled by independent Jewish kingdoms under King David, his son Solomon, who followed, and their successors. King David established Jerusalem as Israel's capital around the year 1000 before the Common Era, and his son Solomon built the first temple in the city of Jerusalem. Around 400 years later, Israel was conquered by Babylon, and the temple was destroyed, with many Jews taken back to Babylon into exile. But soon after this, Babylon was conquered by Persia, and the Persian king Cyrus permitted the Jews living in exile to return to Israel and to rebuild the Holy Temple. Around 200 years later, Israel fell under the domination of the Greek Empire. But under the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, they successfully revolted, and they restored Jewish sovereignty. But it didn't last very long, because soon afterwards, around the year 70 before the Common Era, we lost our independence once again, and this time to the Roman Empire. By the year 66 of the Common Era, the Jewish people had become fed up. We just had it with the Roman occupation, and we revolted. It took Rome 4 years to put down the revolt, and in doing so, they destroyed Jerusalem and the Holy Temple in the year 70 of the Common Era. But contrary to popular belief, this did not end the presence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And our resistance against Rome didn't end either. So 65 years later, in 135 of the Common Era, under the leadership of Bar Kokhba, the Jews revolted against Rome once again. It took 3 years this time before Rome crushed this revolt. And yet the country still remained primarily Jewish. It was at this time that the Romans changed the name of the ancient Jewish kingdom of Judea to Syria Palestina. The Philistines were an ancient enemy of the Jewish people, and the Romans used this name of Palestine to replace the historic name of the country and to sever the attachment between the Jewish people and their land, and to obliterate the historic Jewish identity of the land. But still, the Jewish community in Palestine continued to rebel, and they attempted once again to expel Roman occupation around the year 350 of the Common Era. Even during these centuries, when Palestine was dominated by Rome and then by Byzantium, the Jewish people in Palestine led very rich spiritual and intellectual lives. During this period, the massive legal works of the Mishnah and the Jerusalem Talmud were composed. The Jewish people still continue to fight for independence, and in the year 614 of the Common Era, their armies joined forces with the Persians in expelling the Byzantines from Palestine. So what was it that finally forced most of the Jewish people out of their land? Again, it wasn't the Romans in the year 70. It wasn't until about 600 years later, in the year 636 of the Common Era, that after destroying the large Jewish communities in the Arabian Peninsula, that Muslim Arabs invaded Palestine and reduced the Jewish population to a small minority. They brought in a steady stream of Arabs to colonize the land. They expropriated Jewish property and uprooted Jewish farmers. The real story here, the real story in the Middle East, is not Jews usurping lands from Arabs, but Arabs who usurped land from the Jews. Nevertheless, a remnant of Jews remained in the land. When the Christian Crusaders came and attacked Jerusalem, Jews fought alongside the Arabs to defend the city of Jerusalem. When the Crusaders conquered the city, they gathered up the Jews into a synagogue and burnt them all. The Jews in Palestine, virtually by themselves, defended Haifa, the city of Haifa, against the Crusaders. And they held out for over a month. And although life was difficult for Jews in Palestine at that time, there were Jewish communities all over the country. 50 of them, 50 communities are known to us, including Jerusalem, Tiberias, Ramallah, Ashkelon, Caesarea, and Gaza, among many others. And we have to remember that not only was there a serious Jewish community in Palestine with their presence there continuous since they came into the land with Joshua, but Jews living in the diaspora never gave up their dream of returning to the Holy Land. And there's been a steady stream of Jewish people who did exactly that. In 1140, the year 1140, while the Crusaders were still ruling in Jerusalem, the Spanish philosopher and poet Yehuda Halevi came to live in the land. And you have to appreciate that to get from Spain to Israel back then was very, very difficult. In 1267, at the age of 70, the great Spanish Torah commentary and philosopher and Kabbalist Rabbi Moses ben Nachmanides made the treacherous journey to Jerusalem, where he worked to strengthen the Jewish community there. After the Ottoman Turks conquered Palestine in 1516, there was a resurgence of Jewish life in the Holy Land. The Ottoman Turks were a bit more easygoing and permissive towards the Jews there. and there were about 30 very strong Jewish communities in the 16th century, and the hub was the Galilean city of Tzfat. It became a tremendous center of Jewish scholarship and mysticism. In the year 1555, Tzfat had between 8,000 and 10,000 Jewish residents, but by the end of the century, it grew to between 20,000 and 30,000 people. Anyone with the most basic appreciation of Judaism understands the profound significance that the land of Israel has. For example, according to tradition, the Torah is said to have 613 commandments. Of these, 343 are unique to the land of Israel. You can only do these 343 commandments in the land of Israel. They cannot be performed elsewhere. We know that Jewish prayer has always been directed towards Jerusalem. No matter where a Jew is in the world, they pray facing the Holy Land. They pray facing Jerusalem. And many of our prayers, the content of the prayers, express our desire to be connected once again to the land. Even Jews living very far away from the land of Israel, geographically, were never very far from the land of Israel. It was always very close to our hearts. Judaism can only be practiced optimally in the land of Israel. And this has led, as I mentioned, many spiritual Jews over the centuries to make the arduous journey to live there. So in 1777, 300 followers of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, came mainly from the area of Ukraine to live in Israel. And between 1808 and 1810, 511 disciples of the Gaon of Vilna, the non-Hasidic leader at the time, traveled to live in Israel. Now it's vital to understand this history that we just described. It's critical for us to understand that we've had a constant, uninterrupted presence in the land of Israel because there is a common misconception that the entire Jewish presence in the land of Israel was eradicated after Rome destroyed Jerusalem in the year 70 of the Common Era and exiled the entire population. That is what many people assume. And the often repeated claim of anti-Israel propaganda is that after 1,800 years, we suddenly returned back to Palestine and demanded our country back. It's also critical to know this history in light of the ongoing campaign to deny that the Jewish people ever had any real connection to the land of Israel. Here are two typical examples. In 2001, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Sheikh Ikrimi Sabri, declared in an interview with New Yorker magazine that, quote, "There is not a Jewish stone in Jerusalem. The story of the temple is a myth." On September 24th, 2012, the president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, told reporters at the United Nations that, quote, "Israel has no roots there in the history of the Middle East." So against this persistent denialism, there is overwhelming historical evidence demonstrating the ancient Jewish connection to the land of Israel. Beyond the biblical record, archaeological evidence of Jewish life can be found in more than 30,000 sites across the land of Israel. For example, the land is filled with thousands of Hebrew inscriptions from excavated towns and cities of ancient Israel, and these inscriptions include stamps and seals from official documents containing the names of kings and other people mentioned in the Hebrew Scriptures. I'll mention just a few of the more significant archaeological finds of the past decades. In 1979, during archaeological exploration in Jerusalem, a Jewish tomb from the 7th century before the Common Era was found to contain amulets with the oldest known biblical text. Going back 2,600 years, these silver scrolls contain the words of the priestly blessing found in the book of Numbers, chapter 6, verses 24 to 26. That's pretty Jewish. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls between 1947 and 1956 provides some of the most compelling evidence of the Jewish people's connection to their land. Hundreds of scrolls preserved in ceramic jars dating back to the last 3 centuries before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era were found, including the oldest known copies of the Hebrew Bible, including every book of the Hebrew Bible except for the book of Esther. They also found 24 pairs of tefillin, the phylacteries, the leather phylacteries that are described in the 5 books of Moses and that are worn on the head and on the arm. In 1993, the Tel Dan stele was discovered in northern Israel. This was written on a smooth stone from the 9th century before the Common Era, and it mentions both the kingdom of Israel and the house of David. This is the oldest known non-biblical reference to the Davidic dynasty and provides tangible evidence of Jewish sovereignty in the land. King Hezekiah, ruled Judea 2,700 years ago. He rebelled against the Assyrian king Sancherib and prepared for battle by doing 2 things. He reinforced the walls of Jerusalem, and he dug a half-kilometer tunnel to bring water into the city from the Gihon spring. The Bible describes this project in the 2nd book of Kings, chapter 20, verse 20. Part of this tunnel was explored for the first time since the biblical days in the year 1625 of the Common Era. But it was more fully examined and described in 1838 by Edward Robinson and in 1865 by Charles Warren. What's incredible is that in 1880, 2 children discovered a Hebrew inscription written on stone in the tunnel wall, describing how the project was executed. And this inscription, dated back 2,700 years to the time of the tunnel being built, describes how 2 groups dug from opposite directions until they met up with each other and connected the 2 parts of the tunnel. Now, for decades, Palestinian leaders have been pushing the conspiracy theory that there was never a Jewish holy temple in Jerusalem. And despite their efforts to cover up the evidence and destroy the evidence by their excavation of land on the Temple Mount, the truth cannot be easily hid. For example, 2 findings dating back to the 1st century provide evidence from the Second Temple period. So in 1871 and in 1936, there were large stones that were found with inscriptions written in Greek, found near the Temple Mount. warning non-Jews not to enter the temple courtyard. In 1968, a sculpted cornerstone was found near the western wall with a Hebrew inscription saying, "To the place of trumpeting." And this stone fell from the top of the temple structure when the Romans destroyed it, and the sign designated the place where priests would blow trumpets to announce the arrival of the Sabbath and at other times. These discoveries are just the tip of an iceberg of evidence proving the ancient connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And for much of the corroboration, you don't have to be an academic with access to the latest archaeological discoveries. All one needs to do is to open their eyes. So, for example, the Mount of Olives Jewish Cemetery is over 500 years old, and it has about 100,000 graves in the modern section. There are also people buried at this location from the time of the first temple from 3,000 years ago. In Tzfat, in the Galilee, the Jewish cemetery there is over 2,000 years old. It's not a Crusader cemetery. It's not an Ottoman cemetery. It's not a Muslim cemetery. It's a Jewish cemetery with Jewish inscriptions on the gravestones. The evidence is as clear as day. In 1899, Islamic scholar and Ottoman politician Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi said, "Who can challenge the rights of Jews to Palestine? Good Lord, historically, it is really your country." Now, in his important book called A Place Among the Nations, Benjamin Netanyahu compares the situations of Spain and Israel, where we have in both cases the continued existence of a people whose country had been conquered and the persistent aspirations of that people to be reestablished in their national home. The Muslim Arabs conquered Spain in the year 711 and held it for centuries. The Spaniards held onto only a tiny sliver of the mountains in the north. And the entire composition of the country was transformed into an impressive Arab civilization. The Christians in Spain became a small minority, and most of the country held a Muslim majority. After centuries, the Spaniards began a slow and difficult reconquest. After 5 centuries, they finally recovered Seville and Cordova, and it took another 300 years to regain the kingdom of Granada. And during those 800 years of Arab conquest and domination, Spain never ceased being the homeland of the Spanish people. No one on the planet today believes that their reconquest of their land was a historic wrong. The Jewish people reestablished their sovereignty over their ancestral homeland after not 800 years, but after 1,200 years. But in a manner very different from the Spanish. The Spanish retook their land with bloody wars, but the Jewish people sought a peaceful resettlement and only engaged in military action in self-defense. The modern return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland began in earnest in the late 1800s. And we didn't forcibly conquer the land. We bought it. We purchased it back legally and peacefully. For the most part, we purchased it back from colonial powers who came to the land and conquered it by force. And this included the Muslim Arabs who invaded in the 7th century and the Ottoman Turks who came in the 1500s. Most of the land that was purchased from absentee landlords and real estate speculators living in Damascus and in Beirut. And they had no real connection to the land. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, instructed the Jewish refugees coming back to the land of Israel to never purchase property belonging to local Arab peasants who were working the land. The third major foundation, establishing the rights of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, is based upon international law. Let's try to see how this came about. In the beginning of the 20th century, there was a growing recognition in the world, on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, that the Jewish people deserved to have a national home in their historic homeland. This was famously articulated by the British government in 1917 in what is known as the Balfour Declaration. The text of the letter reads as follows. It was sent to Lord Rothschild. I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. And here is the resolution. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this objective, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. A few years later, this declaration was accepted by both houses of Congress in the United States and was subsequently signed by President Warren G. Harding, where he signed a bill endorsing the Balfour Declaration. Now, the Balfour Declaration was essentially a statement of intent. It didn't have any binding legal force. It had no teeth in it. It would take a few more years for this to transpire. What finally got the wheels turning was the end of the First World War in 1918. During this war, the Turkish Ottoman Empire joined forces with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire against the Allied powers that included the British Empire, which included Canada, and France and Russia, and the United States, who entered the war in 1917. After the Allied victory in the war, a peace conference was convened in the year 1919 in Paris to discuss the new map that the world needed, and they had to work out other vital issues as well. Since the Turkish Ottoman Empire had controlled the lands of the Middle East, the conference in Paris would deal with the disposition of these lands. The Arabs from the area were intent on securing an Arab state that would include present-day Syria, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. That was what they wanted. The issue of a Palestinian Arab claim was not raised by any Arab leader at the Paris conference. In fact, it wasn't raised by any Palestinian Arabs in Palestine. In fact, the Arabs viewed the Zionists as potentially useful allies for their goals. In fact, a month before the Paris conference, the leader of the Arab delegation signed an agreement with Chaim Weizmann, calling for, quote, the closest possible collaboration between the Jewish and Arab peoples in the development of the Arab state and the development of Palestine. The agreement stated that the Constitution of Palestine should afford the fullest guarantees for carrying into effect the British government's Balfour Declaration of November 1917, and that all necessary measures shall be taken to encourage and stimulate the immigration of Jews into Palestine on a large scale. In return, the Zionist organization agreed to use its best efforts to assist the Arab state in providing the means for developing the natural resources and economic possibilities thereof. Later, the head of the Arab delegation wrote to Felix Frankfurter, who was a member of the American delegation, and he said, our deputation here in Paris is fully acquainted with the proposals submitted yesterday by the Zionist organization to the peace conference, and we regard them as moderate and proper. We will wish the Jews a hearty welcome home. Now, the Paris conference was attended by 30 nations and was essentially functioning as the world government at that time. The Allied powers had the authority to establish new borders, and their decisions were recognized as international law. The first order of business at the Paris conference was the creation of the League of Nations. Another issue on the agenda was to dispossess Turkey of all of its land in the Middle East. They lost the war, they lose their land. And that land that was taken from Turkey would be turned into mandates. Now, in the mandate system, the advanced powers like France and Britain would administer a territory until the fledgling state could be established and govern themselves. And this mandatory system was enshrined in the covenant of the League of Nations. Now, while the Zionist delegation presented their proposals that reflected the thrust of the Balfour Declaration at the Paris conference, the Jewish Zionist delegation basically said they want this state. They want to be able to establish a state. It didn't happen at the Paris conference. Although their claims were favorably received by most of the Western powers, no official decisions about the disposition of the former Turkish Ottoman land was taken at the Paris conference. It was only a year later, at the San Remo conference in Italy, that these issues were finally decided. And there at San Remo, the Balfour Declaration was enshrined as international law. It was no longer just the nice sentiments and the intentions of the British Empire. It now became enshrined as international law. At this conference in San Remo, held under the auspices of the Supreme council of the principal Allied powers who were the victors in World War I, a number of extremely important decisions were reached. Until San Remo, as I just mentioned, the Balfour Declaration had only been an expression of intent by Great Britain. The San Remo Resolution turned the Balfour Declaration into a document of international law. What did this mean? What it meant was that legal title to Palestine was now transferred from the Allied powers to the Jewish people. And not only, by the way, to the small Jewish community at the time living in Palestine, it was to the Jewish people at large in the world. To the millions of Jews in the world, this land of Palestine belonged to them. Arabs were given similar rights, equivalent rights, in Syria and in Mesopotamia. But San Remo did not grant Arabs any such rights in Palestine. They had their own areas they would be given. And this transfer of title and sovereignty of the Jewish people in Palestine, according to San Remo, are irrevocable. Irrevocable. According to the San Remo Resolution, this means that the terms finalized at San Remo cannot be rolled back by the League of Nations or by its successor, the United Nations, afterward. Now, 2 years after the San Remo Resolution, the mandate for Palestine was confirmed by the Council of the League of Nations in July of 1922 and was ratified unanimously by the 52 members of the League of Nations. So when we consider the three major foundations for the claims of the Jewish people to the land of Israel, it should be obvious that no other people in the world has a stronger claim to the land that they are on. No other nation today was promised their land by God in the Bible. Virtually no other people in the entire world today have been connected to their land for 4,000 years and living on it continually for 3,300 years. And what other people in the world today have had their historical connection to their land ratified as international law? If the Jewish people have no right to the land of Israel, no nation today has a right to the land that they're on.